To start with Ambassador Link Bloomfield. I consider when I want to find out anything about history, accurate history, truth, history about NCRI, the MEK, and the history of our country and what we've done and not done in history, but more importantly, where we can go from here. Because what we want to focus on is we want to remember the past, we want to learn history, but we also want to know where are we going from here and how do we get there. So it's with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce Ambassador Bloomfield to share his thoughts. I know of no one who has done more work academically to create and write and capture the true history of the MEK, NCRI, the critically important leadership of Maryam Rajavi. And if you leave here with one thing today, leave with this. This is truly, as I've said before, Jeffersonian democracy for the future of Iran. It's where Iran is going to go and wind up, and we're going to make it happen hopefully in the very near future. So, Link, over to you.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking General Jones for inviting me to join this panel. As someone whose first 8 years in government service were in the Pentagon as a civilian policymaker, I don't know if I can overstate what it means to me to be sitting next to these three very distinguished senior military leaders who have given more to their country than I believe I could ever imagine, and it's a great honor to sit with them. So what I want to do today is explain to you why I have studied this issue. It's very simple. I believe my government, and this isn't about the NCRI, I believe my government should make decisions based on correct information. It's a very dangerous world. There are wars in Europe, there's a deterring war in Asia, there's war in the Middle East. We're the superpower. People are contesting our power. I want to make sure that we know the right facts about Iran, and it's been difficult. From the moment I started to look into the issue, I suspected that something wasn't right about the facts. And so I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes, if you'll bear with me. And I'm going to end by thanking all of you for your public service, the members of Congress, the staff members. Your oversight role could not be more important now. I hope I can convince you, and I hope you can convince your members to have a policy hearing this fall aimed at a bipartisan consensus, a new look at what we should be doing on Iran. And so let me get right into it. If we were holding this event 15 years ago, same event, people would be looking at us in Washington and around the world and saying, what are those distinguished generals doing at the table? What are they talking about the MEK, PMOI? Why are they talking about them? They were a violent Marxist, Islamist group. It's a cult. They killed Americans in the 1970s. They were part of the hostage crisis and the embassy takeover. They were traitors to their own country. They fought on the side of Saddam Hussein. They were kind of a strike force against the Kurds and the Shia. They sent their children away from Iraq. Who does that? And they killed thousands of Iranians, and they have no support inside Iran, and there's no relevance to this group to the future of the country. That's what you would have heard 15 years ago today. 2024, everything, with one exception, I'll get to that, has changed. A little over a decade ago, there were 4 major court cases contesting the idea that the NCRI, MEK, PMOI was a terrorist group and belonged on these lists in Europe and North America. There was a trial in Britain that went to the Superior Court. There was a trial at the EU that they had to register twice. There was one in France, an 8-year investigation, and there was one in the United States, the Court of Appeal of the District of Columbia. All of them superior courts, all of them where, if you will, the foreign policy bureaucracy was pushing to keep them on the list because they knew Tehran wanted that and they hoped it would win them some favor. All of them were defeated. The NCRI was removed from all terrorism lists. The French
magistrate concluding an 8-year investigation said they should never have been on any list. There was never an indication of terrorism. They never targeted civilians, and they had the right of legitimate resistance to tyranny. So that has changed. We've done a lot of, we have the receipts. We know what really happened. They did not kill the Americans in the 1970s. Others did that. They did not participate in the embassy takeover and the hostage crisis. They did not fight on Saddam Hussein's side. At no point did, they weren't even in Iraq until 1986. And then they had no weapons until 1987. This is 7 years into the war. At no point did they ever conduct an operation in tandem with Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces, ever. So all of that is false. These are all false narratives. And you can see, soon after these terrible things were done to America, Americans being killed, the hostage crisis, the embassy being besieged, no one in Washington was blaming the MEK or the NCRI for this. There were letters of support to Masoud Rajavi from Senator Edward Kennedy, from then Congressman John McCain, from President-elect Bill Clinton, who sent a letter to Auvers-sur-Oise in north of Paris, saying, we look forward to consulting you as a champion of human rights. They didn't know about these terrible acts? No. The accusations only started in the 1990s. And they started in 1997 when the administration of President Clinton made a gesture to the new Khatami government and put the MEK on the US list of foreign terrorist organizations. They stayed on that list for 12 years. I can tell you now, at no time did any national security leader in America have information about terrorism by the MEK. The FBI wasn't even told in advance about the listing of this group. It was done as a gesture. And to give you some idea of that, we had reports on so-called terrorist groups. Here's what happened in 1981. We won't go into it, but the leader, Masoud Rajavi, and the president of the country, Bani Sadr, had to flee because a reign of terror was started by the Ayatollah and his people. So this is what our report said for many years, for 12 years, starting in 1993. In the 1980s, the MEK's leaders were forced by Iranian security forces to flee to France. That's what happened. But then, in 2006, all of a sudden, we have a new narrative. Here's what they were saying. In 1981, MEK leadership attempted to overthrow the newly installed Islamic regime, leading to an expanded Iranian government crackdown that forced MEK leaders to flee to France. In other words, it was the MEK's fault. And the Islamic regime, the public, bore no responsibility. They were attacked. They had to fight back. That's all false. And it only started, as I say, in 2006, decades after the facts in question. General Jones and other prominent Americans were criticized for going to Paris and speaking to this group. They could see that Mrs. Rajavi would be lighting candles and putting flowers next to hundreds of photographs. Who were these people? They were late teenagers, young 20s, men and women, many women. And so they were called a cult. And the governments didn't believe what the NCRI was telling them. But this summer, there's been one more major development, and I have to really call it a foot stomp. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in Iran, a professor in London, Dr. Rahman, has issued a report after 7 years of study, and he has concluded that what we've been saying all along about the atrocities in Iran are true. And just to give you an idea, he said that between 1979 and 1988, the authorities in the Islamic Republic of Iran waged a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population pursuant to and in furtherance of a premeditated and religiously motivated state policy to exterminate a large part of the political spectrum. They were perceived as religious enemies of the theocratic rule. They wanted to be modern Muslims, not Khomeini Muslims. This involved the commission of mass murder through summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions, imprisonments, torture, rape, and other sexual offenses, persecution, enforced disappearances, and other inhumane acts. That just came from the United Nations. It's now official that this regime is guilty of atrocity crimes against tens of thousands of their people, represented by the NCRI. So that's now a fact, along with the debunking of all of the terror allegations. I said that everything has changed except for one thing, and that's the Washington establishment. And I want to be kind here, but the government, the media, and the think tank community, of which I have been a part, hasn't changed their view. If you look it up today, they'll still say the same thing that we would have heard 15 years ago. They haven't moved off of that lily pad, even though the facts have dramatically changed. And so when they do focus on the Iran threat, they talk about the nuclear enrichment problem, which is of course important. But they bring in all of my old friends from the Soviet US arms control community who know nothing about religious disagreements inside Iran, who couldn't care less about who's a resistance person and who's in power. They don't do politics. And so there's very little focus on what I just told you. Here's what Washington needs to focus on. They need to start with the threat to the US homeland. Both political campaigns have been hacked. There have been physical threats against one of the major candidates for president. There have been murder for hire allegations in Maryland, the stabbing of Salman Rushdie, the attempted abduction of Masih Alinejad twice from New York City. You've had two major colleagues of General Kellogg who are under security threat from the regime in Iran, and more. You had a memo in March from the White House saying that Iran wanted to target with cyber attacks the clean drinking water supply of the United States. It goes on and on. But as we just heard, it's now in Europe as well. And we could go all the way through drones and now ballistic missiles in Ukraine. We could talk about cyber attacks and bombing threats in Albania. We could talk about the attempt to kill a distinguished supporter of the NCRI in Madrid outside his home. And that was traced back to a North African gang that was hired by Iran that committed 2 murders in the Netherlands a few years back. There was an attempted bombing of our rally in 2018 in Paris. It would have been a mass casualty event, as big as anything ISIS ever did. And yet they caught it. They went to trial, 20 years in prison in Belgium. The Iranians seized a Belgian hostage, an aid worker, Van de Castile, who worked for the Norwegian Refugee Fund. Put him in jail, 45-year sentence, 72 lashes, and the Belgians, unfortunately, caved in and traded this terrorist bomber, spy, for Van de Castile. The Swedes put Hamid Nouri on trial, convicted him of war crimes for the 1988 massacre of civilians, of political prisoners. And then the Iranians seized an EU official, Johan Floderus, a Swede, kept him in jail for 2 years, and persuaded Sweden to extradite and trade this convicted war criminal back to Iran, which they did, and of course greeted them as national heroes. We need to focus on the threat to the US homeland. We need to focus on the Europe and the threat to the Middle East. And I'm just going to go right to the core here. I believe that Iran was absolutely behind the Hamas attack on October 7th. And I think a lot of people do, but the 2024 Global Threat Assessment of the US intelligence community formally assessed that Iran was surprised by this attack, which the more I talk to senior leaders in the Middle East, it appears that this was more than a year in planning. And if you look at how much equipment was amassed and how well planned this was, I think they're going to be embarrassed when they find out a lot of people thought something was going to happen 50 years after the war. And so it was predictable. And so if you look at it the way Washington hasn't looked at it, if you look at this as Iran needed this to happen, Iran wanted to mess up the Abraham Accords. They wanted to make sure that Saudi Arabia and Israel didn't come together, and suddenly they have a major undeclared nuclear power on their side, and Iran's nuclear threat doesn't scare anyone quite as much. And Saudi Arabia has always said they will do anything Iran has, they will have. So we don't hear that in our press. There's no real analysis of that. So we need to look at the non-state militias, and I hope that my colleagues on the panel will address that. And finally, of course, the human rights atrocities inside Iran. Even under the new President Pezeshkian, the so-called moderate, there were over 100 executions in Iran in August. There were 26 in one day. One of them was public. That's a crime against humanity. Where is Washington on the real threat from Iran? I think we have a major counterintelligence problem. You may have heard of the Semaphore report. There are agents of influence. There was a major hack of the foreign ministry, 50 terabytes of information, which revealed communications from people that we listen to inside the Beltway with people back in Iran in ministries for over 8 years. And some of them are still in government. Some of them are serving in advisory capacities. The Congress needs to look into this. The Congress needs to get to the bottom of that. We need to understand who in the intelligence community provided this information that Iran was surprised by October 7th. And we're way behind the world on studying the Iranian opposition. And I'm near finishing here, but this is what has changed. The 10-point plan that General Jones just mentioned to you is now supported, as these numbers have probably gone up in the last several weeks, by 125 former presidents and prime ministers, 4,000 parliamentarians from legislatures in 40 countries, including 34 majorities around the world, support the NCRI and the 10-point plan, and 75 Nobel laureates. They've all endorsed Mrs. Rajavi, the NCRI, and the 10-point plan. And what is the U.S. government position? They have repeated the same thing over and over again, including 2 years ago. This is coming from my old bureau in which I served, the Near East Bureau. The United States does not see the MEK as a viable democratic opposition movement that is representative of the Iranian people. The State Department continues to have serious concerns about the MEK as an organization, including allegations of abuse against its own members. Okay, if you look it up, you will see many stories, New York Times, BBC, and others, Human Rights Watch a few years ago, that quote former MEK members saying terrible things about what took place behind closed doors. I guarantee you, every single one of them was on the payroll of Iran's intelligence ministry when they were talking. We need to understand that. So look, this is a busy election season. Congress has a lot of legislation to worry about, but we need a policy hearing. And we need to have a bipartisan policy that addresses these issues. And we need to hear from genuine U.S. national security experts like Generals Jones, Walters, Kellogg, and others. The elected leaders in both parties, for example, have for years said, Iran must never have the bomb. We vow that Iran will never have the bomb. They've said it over and over again. What's the policy? What's the plan? We need to get to that issue. How do you stop the flow of weapons that caused the October 7 and the aftermath from Iran to the proxy forces, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis? Israel's security depends on cutting down that arms flow. What's the plan? What's the mission and rules of engagement for U.S. forces who are protecting our friends in the CENTCOM area of responsibility? We can't let the Revolutionary Guards have a free pass in the region, obviously. Should we have a new authorization for the use of military force? I hope you will address that with your members. And how do we deter further hostage taking? These people have become geopolitical vandals. Whenever they get in trouble, someone gets seized. And it needs to stop. Above all, the United States needs to update its knowledge about the organized resistance. Why does this regime fear educated citizens promoting a version of Islam consistent with democratic values and gender equality? And what is the role of the NCRI in helping the Iranian population stand up to religious tyranny that no Western population would ever tolerate? We would be doing exactly the same thing. The regime in Tehran is obsessed with the resistance. There's no other credible opposition. There's been an average of one anti-MEK book per month for 40 years, 5,200 books, an average of more than 100 anti-MEK articles from the regime every month over the last 20 years. That's what, 12,000 articles. As my friend Ali Riza has said, not only is Iran the epicenter of conflict and insecurity and repression in the Middle East, it is also the epicenter of the path to a more peaceful and prosperous region, starting with the more than 85 million citizens of Iran. So let's get a hearing and let's hear from our senior military leaders. Thanks.